Okay. Well, my name is Emma Marris, and I'm an environmental writer. And I came to do this by becoming interested in science and interested in writing and wanting to combine those two things. So I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and I got an English degree at the University of Texas, Austin, BA in English, and then I didn't really know what to do with that. So I went back to Seattle and got a job as a secretary in the botany department at the University of Washington. And my secretarial duties were not particularly inspiring, but the work that was being done in the botany department was fascinating. There was a whole greenhouse filled with interesting experiments and labs, and tissue cultures and genetics work and all sorts of cool stuff. And I've always rather liked plants. So in pretty short order, I was in danger of actually losing my job because I was virtually never at my desk. I was always in somebody's lab, tagging along, trying to figure out what they were doing. And I'd always wanted to be a writer, so my new interest in the science and my long-standing interest in writing suggested this possible career as a science writer, which is a sort of a niche occupation. And there are master's programs in science writing, so I applied to a few of those and ended up going to a program that no longer exists at Johns Hopkins, which was run by Anne Finkbeiner, who's an excellent science writer herself. So I went off to Baltimore, spent a year in Baltimore, learning how to write about stars and cells and scientists themselves, who are an interesting group of people to write about because they have sort of been culturally indoctrinated that they are not to let their values and their personalities and their emotions influence their work. And yet, of course, their very choice of work is usually dictated by their values, their emotions, their life histories. And getting them to admit to this, getting them to tell you how they felt when they got their results or what motivated them to study a particular problem is sort of an interesting bit of psychological wrestling that you've got to engage with them. So I've pretty much enjoyed that part of my job. After my degree was complete, I got an internship at the scientific journal Nature. It was a 6-month gig, and then they were kind enough to hire me on at the end of that. So I became a staff writer for them for a few years in Washington, D.C. I covered various beats. I wrote about chemistry. I went to a bunch of chemistry conventions. I wrote about occasionally astronomy, other topics. And I still do for them every once in a while, write short pieces on topics far away from environmental science. But I eventually gravitated towards the conservation biology and the ecology and the sort of outdoor field-based environmental science. And partly that was just because it was really fun to report on these. If you report on chemistry and you go and you visit a chemistry lab, they're often quite similar to one another. No matter what part of the world you're in, a chemistry lab always looks quite alike. But these field sites where ecologists work all over the world are just fantastically diverse and different, and there's a certain amount of adventure sometimes in even getting to the site, and you're outdoors, and there are methods that are involving sort of digging trenches and boring holes into sediments and capturing animals and fitting them with collars, and it's just really, in some ways it's the lazy science to write about because it's so visual, there's so much going on, it's all happening at this level, sort of macro level that we're really comfortable with. It's not microscopic or cosmic. It's right in the middle. So it was, it was the easiest and most kind of compelling thing for me to write about. And of course, I had been an environmentalist my whole life. I grew up in Seattle to sort of very liberal parents and hung out with a very kind of set of people that would just reflexively identify themselves as environmentalists. And we were all taking our couscous to high school lunch in little reusable yogurt containers back in the 90s. Those were my people. But I have to admit that it wasn't until I started covering the field as a science that I really began to think very hard about many of the sort of assumptions that I made about the environment and many of the sort of narratives about the environment that I had just taken on board unreflexively, or reflexively rather. Things like humans ruin everything that they touch, and we're headed for the catastrophe. that, everything is going to hell in a handbasket, essentially. And that, for example, one thing that growing up in Seattle, we have quite a bit of old growth forest within a couple 100-mile radius. And those landscapes were always treated as the right nature, the correct nature, the sort of nature that should exist everywhere. And of course, much of the landscape was covered in secondary forest, as ecologists call it, the forest that grew back after it was logged. In fact, you might say that much of it is tertiary or quaternary forest, and they've been logged many times. And in fact, as a child, I had a friend who lived down the block, and her parents had a piece of secondary forest that they went to on the weekends, and her father was a Boeing engineer, and he'd built this fantastic hexagonal cabin out there. I think it was a hexagon, it might have been an octagon. It's been a long time now. But we would go up there on the weekends and run around in this secondary forest and climb the vine maples and play. We often played inside the massive stumps that were left over from the first pass of logging. You could often still see the notches on the side where the loggers had put in the boards. They had to reach a certain height on the tree before they could effectively cut it down, because some species of these trees are quite buttressed along the base. So they would kind of dig these notches in and put in these things called springboards, and then stand on the springboards and saw the tree down. And so we would climb around on these stumps. And as a child, that was nature, and in fact I wrote reams of very sappy nature poetry about such landscapes, because I had not yet been taught that, in fact, these were trashy remainders left over after humans had pillaged the good stuff. But once I kind of got that understanding as an adolescent, it did something interesting to me, and I think what it sort of did was it turned me off of interacting with nature. Because suddenly most nature that I could easily access during the week or even on the weekend with my limited gas budget was not good enough. It wasn't the pristine old growth forest of the Hoh rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula. I had been taught to sort of despise it. So I sort of stopped going there, and I stopped hiking and backpacking. I stopped camping. I'd done a ton of car camping with my dad and a little bit of backpacking with some friends. And I kind of stopped doing all that and just hung out in the city for a good decade. But when I started going back out into nature as an adult, working for nature, it was with a completely different viewpoint, because I was now seeing it through the eyes of these ecologists. And many of these ecologists shared this sense that the only good nature was pristine nature. But many of them were also troubled, because the more we were learning about how humans had interacted with nature over long stretches of time, both historic and prehistoric, post-European colonization of North America, pre-European colonization of North America, the more we were beginning to learn that virtually no landscapes in North, South America, or in fact anywhere on the planet, were unmodified by humans at some point in time. And so if all of these landscapes were that had this heritage of being manipulated by humans, either by, being burned or being occasionally harvested, or having plants planted out in the forest so they would be convenient to be gathered later, having the game animals in them hunted. And of course, in North America, there were lots of extinctions that happened about 13,000 years ago, mastodons, giant ground sloths, all these amazing creatures that were here in the Pleistocene that are now gone. And I was covering all these papers showing that the chances were pretty good that human hunting had a big part to play in those extinctions. So the more I learned about these ecosystems that surrounded us, even the ones that seemed like they were timeless, like they'd been there since the beginning of time, the more I was beginning to see them as these sort of historical products of human action. And then it's like, now what are we supposed to be doing here? We're going to restore this piece of land to this date because that's when the first white man came here. That's often the way it is, especially in North America and Australia. You go to places and they'll say, well, we think it's a native species if it was here before Columbus, or if it was here before Lewis and Clark, or if it was here before Captain Cook. I gave a talk in Dayton, Ohio, and there in their county commissioner, their invasive species board, they count it as a native species if it was present before some guy named Ebenezer Zane showed up. And that just made me laugh. There's I saw a picture of Ebenezer Zane with his big beard, and he was some early colonist. And I mean, every place has its Ebenezer Zane. And it's a completely historical baseline. It's completely not based on nature or ecology or when the ecosystem was right. It's just based on when the first white guy showed up. And that seems like a totally odd way to structure an environmental movement. So there were a lot of people running around questioning this and trying to figure out what it all meant and looking and trying to figure out how, as the climate warms from climate change, how will we be doing the work of conservation? Are we going to be trying to force plants and animals to stay in the same places they were, in 1850 when we first recorded them, because that's where they should be? Or are we going to allow them to adapt and move as the climate warms up into potentially new areas where if they show up today, they might be considered invasive? I mean, there's a lot of interesting questions, and I began to become, to put it mildly, a little bit obsessed by them. And so I eventually, after writing a series of features for Nature, and during that time I moved to Columbia, Missouri, because my husband was finishing his PhD there in philosophy. I decided that I needed to write a book about it. Anne Finkbeiner, my mentor at Johns Hopkins, had told me that book writing was not particularly lucrative, that it took a lot of time, and that I should only consider it if I was obsessed. And duly, I was obsessed. I was definitely obsessed with these ideas. And so I pitched the book, and I was lucky enough to get a contract, and I wrote the thing, I guess, mostly during 2009, because my daughter was born in January 2010, and that's when I finished the first draft, within a couple of weeks of each other. I have a picture of this newborn baby on a bed and a big manuscript next to it, and they're both around the same size, and they both took around the same amount of time to produce. So then I did a substantial revision, and it ended up coming out in 2011, and that book was Rambunctious Garden. The title is meant to suggest that Earth is perhaps more like a garden than we thought because of this massive human influence, but that it need not be kind of top-down controlled or sterile or overly ordered, that we should in fact invite more wildness into our own personal humanized spaces and let them be more rambunctious. That how we should perhaps approach conservation going forward is to let our human spaces become wilder, while at the same time we accept and embrace the human qualities of our wild spaces. So since the book came out, I have been I have had what you might call a dual career. I spend maybe half my time talking about the book and giving lectures and kind of following up on some of the ideas in the book. And another half of the time I spend just doing the regular work of environmental journalism, writing short news articles about birds with excitingly long migrations, or I'm going to Peru in June to write a piece for National Geographic on the Peruvian Amazon and the indigenous people that live there and how they've influenced that part of the world. So I guess I count myself as extremely lucky that I have this great job, which I more or less stumbled into, but I enjoy completely. I just love it.
Sounds like a great life. I like to trade. In fact, I very much would like to trade. I've been trying to get into my edge of that for decades. It's hard to get into labs with a camera.
Sure. Yeah. No. Notebooks are less threatening than cameras, even though they can be just as they can record just as much.
Well, we have the luxury of some time. Let's start back a bit. This matter of science writing. One of my heroes, John McPhee, was writing about oranges and Oh, all sorts of things, and has stumbled into massive science writing.
Right.
3 big volumes on geology and lots of other things. Is science writing importantly different from good writing?
Probably not. But I think that the science writers like to hang out with each other. I think it's more of the distinction is perhaps more in the personalities of the writers that pursue it. Often they were scientists themselves, and then they left the sort of science career track for one reason or another. And often we're just, nerdier, I guess, than a political journalist or a food journalist or something. And so we kind of like to hang out together and make nerdy science jokes. So it may be that it's more of a community rather than a distinct practice. I'm sure people would disagree with me on that. There's certainly, the kind of premise of all these degree programs is that it is different enough that you need to study it, in a different way than just getting a journalism degree or going and just getting a creative writing degree. And there are some special challenges. Reading some of the scientific literature in a field that you didn't study in can be very intimidating, and you got to kind of develop strategies for cutting through the jargon and translating really abstract, immunology is the worst. I think that's probably the most difficult thing that I've ever written about is immunology. In some ways, but I think ultimately good writing is good writing, and frankly, a lot of the science writing that's most celebrated is really about scientists. It's really about people. People like to read about people. And that is not so different than a profile of an actress or a chef.
Can you say a bit about the research challenges? You mentioned immunology is particularly challenging. What's it like to get an assignment for you're supposed to do astronomy, and basically that there are stars and they're different than planets, right, and they're different than asteroids, and some are bigger than others in different colors. End of story. What happens to you?
So for a long time, I was a sort of substitute editor for a section in Nature called Research Highlights, and it's got 10 stories about papers that came out that week in all fields. And they're each like 110 words long. And it was a fantastic challenge to put that together every week, because you had to read papers in immunology, papers in astronomy, papers in material science, subatomic physics, and when we had help, I would be able to consult with the relevant editors at Nature and say, is this paper any good, or what does this paper mean? So it was good to go to somebody who knows their stuff. But you also you just develop a certain amount of confidence. You put the paper in front of you and you say to yourself, this looks like just a bunch of crazy acronyms, but every acronym can be decoded and every piece of jargon can be decoded, and it's just a matter of, it's kind of like reading a foreign language where you have to look up every third word in the dictionary. You get through it. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. The better you get at translating from the particular jargon of these fields into something approaching lay English. Some of these fields are very difficult because what they're doing is all microscopic or all, abstract math, for example. You can't, it's very difficult to, if you don't have the right kind of brain, and I don't think I do, it's very difficult for you to visualize that and then represent it. So it helps to interview the scientists and ask them, how would you explain this to your grandmother? And some of them are able to come up with really compellingly good explanations, as long as they're imagining their own grandmother there. Of course, if your grandmother was some Nobel Prize winning physicist, then the trick doesn't work and you have to substitute somebody else.
Yeah. Feynman, I remember, was wonderful at speaking to his grandmother about physics. So that section fascinates me. So where do those articles come from? I mean, who puts the stack together?
Well, the editor, currently her name is Corey Locke, who's doing it now, and I haven't been doing substituting on it for a while, but the editor does, and the editor is a journalist essentially. So you get the table of contents lists from as many prominent journals as you can think of emailed to you. Mm-hmm. And then you scan the table of contents and you look at all the titles, and if you see one that you think is interesting, you get the whole paper and then you start to work through it. You also desperately beg for suggestions from the editors at Nature whose job it is to weed through submissions to the journal, because they're all incredibly well-respected members of their subfields. And presumably they do scan they look at the other journals that are coming across, and they'll give you suggestions. They'll say, well, actually, this paper is really quite nice. And then, you sort of build your 10, and there's always this moment in the week in which you're terrified you're not going to have your 10, and then you have to assign them all out to reporters and then edit them and get them back and sub-edit them and find pictures and lay it all out on the page so it all fits beautifully. So it can be pretty challenging. It's definitely a full-time job to do these 2 pages every week. But it's awfully fun because you feel like you're just sort of surfing on the cresting wave of science,
So, I've understood vaguely, but maybe you can get it precise for me, that Nature isn't just another publication. It comes pretty close to being an organ of science, of world science in a certain way. I mean, the New York Times says, according to a recent publication in Nature.
Right.
It's also not sort of popular science. It has a gatekeeper function somehow. Can you explain a little bit what
Sure.
Nature is?
Sure. So the sort of coin, or the kind of way that scientists talk to each other, and the sort of official record of science is peer-reviewed journals. And the peer review part of it is you submit you do your experiments, you come to your conclusions, you write it up, you submit it to a journal, and then they send it out to 3 or 5 other scientists who are your peers. They work in the same field, and they read it over and they give recommendations about whether or not the journal ought to publish it, whether it's good enough quality, it has a big enough sample size, whether they made any mistakes of reasoning, and so on. And they're often anonymous, so that the team that has submitted the work don't know who they are. And then if all the peer reviewers give it the thumbs up, it is published in this peer-reviewed journal, and it's now kind of part of the record of science. And there are lots of peer-reviewed journals. Most of them are field-specific, so you'll have some journals that I tend to read are Ecology, which is put out by the Ecological Society of America, or the Animal Behavior. It's a journal all just about how animals behave. And then there are some journals that are a little more prominent and that take papers from all fields, and Nature is one of those. I think it's probably fair to say that Nature and Science, which is another journal, another one-word titled journal, are probably the 2 most prominent scientific journals going. They come out every week with a lot of peer-reviewed papers, and then as a sort of added bonus for their readers, they also have a news section in the front. And the news section is where I worked for many years, and I still contribute there as a freelancer sometimes. And the news section is not peer-reviewed. The news section is written just like any old magazine, but by a stable of staffers and freelancers who tend to specialize in science writing. So the news might be about some of the peer-reviewed work, or it might be about, the NSF is changing its rules for grant applications, or, did you hear there's an interesting scientific fraud case in Norway, or it's sort of more about like the business of science, the life of a scientist. It's like Newsweek for scientists, and it's in the front of the book. So it's a little bit of a hybrid publication in a way. It's a news magazine as well as being a journal of record.
So when you describe the peer review process in these journals, a couple aspects of them seem worth kind of worrying about. One is there's got to be a pretty substantial time lag, right?
Yes.
How much is the time lag between my discovering something interesting and an article getting out?
It varies from publication to publication, and in fact, in the sort of Nature and Science are faster than most of the smaller niche publications. It's so in philosophy, my husband is a philosopher. It'll often take more than a year, sometimes 2 years between when a paper is even accepted to when it comes out. There's a huge timeline. Nature's quite a bit faster, and there's a certain trend towards quite quick publication online. So sometimes you'll see a paper that won't come out in the sort of physical journal that's going to be archived by the university library until June 2016, but it's already available online, so that the work sort of, science can continue to work on it and build on it. And in rare cases of sort of public health or kind of just really news that people need to know, things will be rushed quite quickly. If there was some breakthrough in Ebola treatment, that paper might come out within a week or two. So it's all over the map, but there is often quite a bit of a lag between the discovery and its publication.
Now, is Nature, with respect to its science publications, exactly kind of on a par with the peer-reviewed everything else's? I mean, they accept paper, they get submissions and farm them out to peer reviewers and decide what to do with them. Mm-hmm. You do the same thing. Is that the picture?
Yeah. Now I know I'm no longer a staffer at Nature. I went freelance in about 2007, but I still write for them quite a bit. And yeah, that's how it works. You submit your if you're a scientist, you submit your publication. They organize the peer review. They determine who to send the reviewers to, and then they collect all those reviews, and then those editors make an executive decision based on those reviews. And there's even an appeals process if you feel like you've been unfairly rejected, because the number of submissions to Nature is very high. Everybody wants to be in Nature or Science. And so, a very large percentage of them are rejected. And often, the rejection letter will say something like, there's nothing wrong with this, it's just not quite sexy enough, well, not sexy, but not quite amazing enough for our journal. We only have so many pages. Here are some other journals you might consider submitting it to. We like it very much, we just don't have room for everything.
So would somebody who discovered a new trick that a squirrel did, submit at the same time to Nature and to Animal Behavior? And
oh, yes, the simultaneous submissions question. I don't know where the thinking on that is right now. There's been, in the olden days, it was not done to simultaneously submit. You would submit to Nature and you'd wait till you got your rejection at Nature and then you'd submit it to Animal Behavior. However, in the journalistic world, there has been quite a bit of discussion recently about simultaneous submissions being better for the writer. And I wonder if there's a similar discussion happening in science. It would be quite interesting, I think. The sort of etiquette of only submitting to one journal at a time gives a lot of power to the journals. If you submitted to a lot of journals at once and then got multiple acceptances, you'd be in a position to negotiate for more pages or color photographs or something.
It's a red squirrel.
Yeah.
It better look red. Got it. But I presume this business of simultaneous submission is also a source of delay.
Yes.
Because you can't. They can't. Animal Behavior can't be putting it out for peer review until Nature has put it out for peer review, decided it wasn't appropriate for them.
Yep, that's true. And I think that influences people's decisions also. It can be quite tricky for a young scientist who's trying to build a CV to get a good job. They want these publications on the CV, so they want them to be accepted. So they've got to time it just right. So if they're wildly ambitious and they send it to Science or Nature, it might take that a little while for that rejection to come in. Do they have the luxury of that time, or do they need to get that line on their CV? It can be quite a dicey. They have to really do a cost-benefit analysis of where to submit to. And I think the decision of where should we submit this is one that scientific teams often really wrestle with.
This is the old line about tenure, that deans can often not read, but they can count.
Right.
Well, so, I mean, to cut to the chase, does a place like nature have a nut screen? I mean, the person who wants to establish that squirrels are really aliens from another planet in specially designed suits.
Now, I'm not an expert in the peer review process, but it is my understanding that editors are not required to they don't have to send something out to review. So if they get a paper that suggests that squirrels are aliens in squirrel suits, they can reject without review. They send a very politely worded letter. Thank you very much for your submission. It's just not for us at this time. And then everyone can move on. So, yeah.
Right. And of course, Tesla's idea that Edison's all wet about direct current would probably have made it to the reject file.
Yeah, there are definitely cases where Nature or Science or some other large prominent journal has rejected a paper that's gone on to great fame and fortune elsewhere. It's not a perfect process, and the editors who have to make those decisions, I don't know how they do it. They come into work every day and they have to make hard decisions all day long, and then they go home and then they come back and do it the next day.
A couple of money things seem important to me. First of all, do any of these reviewers get paid?
I don't think so. It's considered part of your sort of academic service to do these reviews. Great, you could put that you're a reviewer for journals on your CV, and it counts as in your favor. But I think it's generally speaking uncompensated.
So you have a sort of massive free editorial board
yes,
who you also don't control.
And advocates for open access publishing bring that point up. So these journals aren't cheap. A lot of them are quite expensive, and subscriptions. Individual subscriptions are wildly expensive. So if you aren't a member of a university, it can be very difficult to access these papers. And in fact, a lot of the freelance journalists that I'm friends with have difficulty accessing these papers. We're constantly begging each other for papers. So there's this open access movement, which there's sort of their crusade is that they believe that all the scientific information should be open and freely available to the public. And there have been moves in that direction. I think a lot of stuff is opened after a certain window of time. Work by government employees is generally made open. But there's people who still want to push that envelope further. And one of the points that they make is that journals charge a lot of money for subscriptions, but a lot of their costs are they don't have to pay for this editorial board. Now they do pay for the editors who sit there at Nature or at Science or at PNAS or at any of these other large journals. They do have staff editors who do the sort of the first cut and who coordinate the process, and they bring a lot of expertise to the table. And they do work really hard, and they're really good at what they do. So I do think that they bring some value to it. But they do have these free advisors. That's true.
Do you happen to know what a subscription to Nature, an individual subscription costs?
I don't know. I don't have a recent figure for you. When I was on staff there, I think it was north of $250 a year.
For weekly.
Yeah, for a weekly issue. But I couldn't tell you what it is now, and that's been many years ago. I haven't worked for them full time since 2007, I think.
So you'd have, my understanding is that in the scheme of journals, that's cheap.
Yeah, I mean, there's some specialty medical journals in particular, I believe, that are the subscription is to over $1,000. So, there are ways to get access, but they're not particularly convenient. You can go to the public library depending on where you live. You can there's the sort of courtesy reprint system where you can actually ask the author himself or herself for a copy, and they can give you a kind of their own personal copy, which is sometimes a little bit different from the one that appeared in the journal. It maybe won't have all the illustrations and stuff.
So it's really quite challenging. I mean, let's say the governor of the state of Minnesota, somebody who has a reason to know these things, says to a staff member, keep an eye out for scientific stuff that might blindside us.
Right.
You just be aware of what's going on. that's really quite a job.
When I lived in Washington, D.C., I'd often go to the Hill for hearings, and it did strike me that virtually all of the, whenever a politician would bring up a new scientific finding, they would bring it up via the Washington Post article that covered that finding. So they wouldn't be waving around the publication from, the biological letters. They would be waving around the Washington Post article about that journal article. Naturally it struck me at the time because it was a way, it sort of testified to the importance of science journalism. If politicians are learning about what's going on in the world of science through science journalism rather than by reading the primary literature, then it is important that the science journalism be good and accurate and fair and all that. But I believe, I don't know if it's a problem of access or probably more likely the fact that they're staffers who are, 21-year-old people who work 80 hours a week are not about to sit down and read a technical paper from chemical and, from the American Chemical Society. They're going to read the journalistic treatment.
So you've got a kind of sediment purifying the water. The editors, the editors of Nature keep an eye on the pricey and obscure journals. The editors of the Washington Post keep an eye on the on Nature and Science,
right.
And then the editorial people at the Star Tribune keep an eye on the Washington Post.
Yeah, there's something to that. And then there's this whole diffuse layer of online content, the bloggers and online magazines like Slate and Salon, and then you have Twitter and all that stuff. So the ecosystem of science communication is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and of course you're then in the blogosphere, nobody knows you're a dog,
right.
And so if you have a belief about squirrels being aliens in
right.
little furry suits,
probably a dog for
that will come up in the search algorithm right next to Scientific American.
Right.
It's a crazy system. I mean, I think about this old ideal of an informed citizen. I mean, it's as close to out the window as you could get.
I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, I don't think that there's been a time in our history where kind of regular people like me and you sit around and go to Royal Society meetings and read the primary literature. I think that people who are busy and have families and jobs have always relied to a certain extent on the media to collect information and present it to them. They may not like it, they may not like the media or trust them completely, but I think that at some level that we're still relying on the media, whatever that means today, to provide that service for us.
Well, I don't want to fight somebody who knows more than I do.
Oh, certainly not.
But I just think about, we never talk about the informed citizen. It's always the informed citizen who's also in a position to pull levers and strings and make phone calls that will be answered. So you think about the CEOs of the major corporations in Minneapolis, so people who can be some serious donors and so forth. Now, and who have enough time to and a certain sense of civic responsibility they need to. So those people are educated most likely at the Washington Post level. I would guess, given what you've told me, more likely at the Washington Post level than the Nature level.
Maybe, yeah.
And that's the thing that worries me. I mean, it's not everybody's access, but there is a fairly serious large group of people who can change the world if they get their heads together. And I'm wondering, and I've always wondered about their access.
I think their access is improving. I mean, I think that, there can still be problems with paywalls and subscription fees and so on. But one thing that I have noticed is that there has been a trend on online journalism, blogs, and so on to actually link directly to the original paper. So in some newspapers that are a little more, some newspapers won't even tell you, they'll just say, a study came out that says, and they won't even tell you where it was published. And then, Washington Post will always say, oh, it was published in Nature this week. But online outlets are now frequently linking directly to the study. So if you're interested, it just takes one click to take you to the primary literature. And I think that's a really good thing. I think that if I can learn how to read journal articles about immunology, anybody can. And it takes a little bit of getting used to the jargon and a little bit of getting used to the structure of them, but they're completely comprehensible if you just make yourself a cup of tea and sit down and plow through it. So I think that we actually might be seeing more people now read the primary literature than we did before the internet.
So a publication that has $250, $300 a year subscription fee will allow linkage to individual articles?
Well, they'll link to, pardon me, I've got to go in 5 minutes. They will usually have the abstract available for free. So you can link to the page that'll have the abstract. The abstract is a standard feature of journal articles. It's 1 to 2 paragraphs. It's at the very beginning, and it's a summary of the entire thing. Here's what we wanted to know, here's what we did, here's what we found out, and sometimes even a sentence about what the implications are. Often that'll be enough for people depending on why they're reading the paper. And if it's not, then they can start looking into ways to get access through if they're not affiliated with any university, through a public library, by requesting a reprint, and so on. I'm very sympathetic with the open access advocates who want to make it totally painless for anybody to access the primary literature. But on the other hand, my previous employers were able to pay these great editors and able to pay journalists as well. And I thought that I think those paid positions offered a lot of value to the reader as well.
Last question. You switched from writing about everything to writing about Rambunctious Gardens,
yeah.
and this particular issue of proper goals for preservation.
Mm-hmm.
Does that seem like a definitive life choice? I mean, are you now? Is this like the Titanic turns? You are now.
That's an excellent question, and I wish we had more time to delve into it, because maybe a good jaw with you would help clarify it for myself. I don't know. It certainly has occupied a great deal of my time and intellectual effort in the last 5 years. So at some level, it's come to dominate what I do. And things that I write for other magazines are sort of spin-offs or related to that overarching question of how do we define nature? What are the right goals for conservation? Sometimes I daydream about being able to do a 180 pivot and write about, basketball, space exploration. But on the other hand, I am still remarkably able to get jazzed and excited and interested in the topic even after following it for so many years. And so it may be that it is the topic for me for at least this decade.
That's great. Well, thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you very much. This was a fun conversation. I enjoyed it.